The candles in the drawing room of Wren Cottage had burned low, and Iris Hartwell understood, long before Sir Edmund Calder cleared his throat, that she was expected to say yes. She had known it from the moment he arrived that evening in his good grey coat, the one he wore only to church and to occasions he considered momentous, and from the careful way her aunt had excused herself to see about the tea and not returned, leaving the two of them alone in a silence thick enough to choke on. She had known it, too, from the particular attention with which the housemaid had dressed her hair that afternoon, humming under her breath as though she were readying a bride rather than a young woman about to be presented with a bargain dressed as a proposal. The whole household, it seemed, had understood what tonight would bring before Iris herself had been given the courtesy of being told. She was 23, old enough by the county's reckoning to have already missed her best chances, plain enough by her aunt's frequent and not unkind observations to require gratitude rather than romance in whatever offer eventually came her way, and poor enough that gratitude, in the eyes of nearly everyone she knew, ought to have settled the matter before Sir Edmund had even opened his mouth. She was aware of all of this, with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent a great deal of time being told, in careful and loving ways, exactly what she was worth to the people who claimed to cherish her. It was not a great deal. It had never been a great deal, not since her father's debts had swallowed what little her mother's family had once possessed, and Iris had long ago stopped expecting the world to value her for anything beyond her usefulness in settling other people's difficulties. He had positioned himself by the mantel as though it were already his, one hand resting against the cold marble, his rings catching the firelight. He was not an unhandsome man. He was, in fact, precisely the sort of man other women in the village sighed over, broad through the shoulders, well-dressed, possessed of an income that made mothers rearrange their daughters' seating at dinner. But Iris had learned, in the 18 months since her father's death, that a man's fortune said nothing of his character, and Sir Edmund's character had revealed itself to her slowly, in small cruelties disguised as jokes, in the way he spoke to servants, in the manner he corrected her opinions in company, as though she were a child reciting a lesson wrong. "You understand what I am offering you, Miss Hartwell," he said now, and his voice had the practiced patience of a man who believed refusal was simply a delay. "Your aunt's situation is not a secret. The note on this cottage falls due at Michaelmas. I have already spoken to her about it." Iris felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she did not move. "You discussed my aunt's finances with her before you discussed marriage with me. I discussed the future of this household, which is the same thing." He smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "I am not a cruel man, Miss Hartwell. I am prepared to settle the debt entirely, and generously, the moment we are wed. Your aunt need never think of it again, nor need you think of anything again, beyond your own comfort." There it was, the whole of it laid bare on the good carpet her aunt had not been able to replace in 3 years. Her hand, her freedom, her name, exchanged for a debt that was not even hers to carry. "And if I decline," something flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it came, "then I imagine your aunt will have a great deal to consider before winter." She did not weep. She had promised herself, on the day they buried her father, that she would not weep in front of people who wished to see it. Instead she rose, smoothed her skirts, and said with a steadiness that cost her more than he would ever know, "Then I decline, Sir Edmund. I am sorry for my aunt's sake. I am not sorry for my own." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Her aunt, Lady Augusta Hartwell, found her an hour later in the small garden behind the cottage, where the last of the autumn roses clung stubbornly to their thorns. Augusta was not a harsh woman, only a frightened one, and fright made her sharp in ways she did not intend. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the exhaustion of a woman who had spent 3 years doing arithmetic that never came out right. "Do you understand that I cannot conjure £400 from the hedgerows?" "I understand it very well, Aunt." "Then why?" "Because I would rather be poor and unmarried than wealthy and owned," Iris said quietly. "I watched what marriage without regard did to my mother. I will not do it to myself for the sake of a mortgage. Augusta's face crumpled, not with anger, but with something closer to grief, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth and turned away, and Iris stood alone in the dying garden, with the terrible knowledge that her own integrity might cost them both everything they had left. It was 2 days later that she first saw the stranger at Rothmere Hall. Rothmere had stood empty of true authority since the old Earl's death that spring, a death that had thrown the entire county into a fever of speculation, for he had left no son, and the cousin presumed to inherit had, according to every rumour circulating from the vicarage to the village green, disappeared from society decades before, under circumstances no one could quite agree upon. Some said he had died in disgrace abroad. Some said he had never existed at all, a fiction invented by lawyers to delay the inevitable claim of nearer, hungrier relations that included, inconveniently for Iris, Sir Edmund Calder himself, who had made no secret of his hope that the estate might yet fall to a branch of the family favourable to his interests. Iris had gone to Rothmere that morning only because her aunt kept bees along the old orchard wall, a small mercy the previous Earl had permitted years before, and someone needed to see to the hives before the frost came. She had not expected to find a man already there, coatless, sleeves rolled to the elbow, examining the crumbling stone of the garden wall, with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone who meant to stay. "You've no business here," she said, more sharply than she intended, startled by the sight of him. He turned, and she was struck first by his stillness, the way he did not startle in return, only regarded her with a calm that felt almost like patience worn thin by long practice. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, dressed plainly enough that she took him at once for a land agent or a surveyor, someone the solicitors had sent ahead of the inheritance to assess what remained. "Forgive me," he said. "I was told the hives belonged to the estate. They belong to my aunt, by the old Earl's kindness. I don't suppose the new one will care to honour it." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to soften it. "Assuming there is a new one at all, and not merely a story invented to keep the vultures circling politely instead of tearing the place apart outright." Something that might have been amusement crossed his face, quickly hidden. "You do not think highly of the family, then?" "I think highly of no family that leaves a house to rot for 6 months while cousins argue over who deserves it most," she said, setting down her basket with more force than necessary. "I beg your pardon. I don't know why I am telling a stranger my opinions of my betters. Perhaps because I asked, and no one else has," he said, and there was something in the plainness of it that disarmed her more than flattery would have. She should have left it there. Instead, she found herself lingering, drawn by the odd ease of speaking to someone who owed her nothing and expected nothing, who did not correct her the way Sir Edmund corrected her, who listened as though her words carried actual weight. She told him, without quite meaning to, of the bees, of her father's death, of the way grief made ordinary tasks feel like penance. She did not tell him of Sir Edmund. That wound was too fresh to hand to a stranger, however gentle his attention. "You speak as though you expect to be disbelieved," he observed, watching her work the smoker with practiced hands. "I am a woman with no fortune and an aunt in debt," she said simply. "I have found that people believe what is convenient to believe, and it is rarely convenient to believe me." He said nothing to that, but something in his expression shifted, some private calculation she could not read, and when she left an hour later with her basket full of comb, she realized she had never asked his name, and he had never offered it. There was an afternoon, not long after, when the ordinary rhythm of their conversation faltered into something else entirely, something neither of them seemed prepared for. She had come upon him standing very still at the edge of the old rose garden, staring at a portrait that had been propped against the wall awaiting rehanging. A stern-faced gentleman from some earlier generation, dressed in the fashions of 40 years past, whose dark eyes bore an uncanny resemblance to the man studying them so intently. "A relation of the family, I should think," she said, coming to stand beside him. "You have the same look about the eyes. if you don't mind my saying so. Perhaps you're a distant cousin of the house yourself, sent to do their dirty work for a few shillings a week." She had meant it as a jest, nothing more, and was unprepared for the stillness that followed, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he answered. "Families carry their resemblances in strange ways," he said carefully. "It would not surprise me at all to learn there was some thread of blood connecting a great house to the humblest of its servants, however carefully that thread is usually hidden." "You speak as though it troubles you," she said, watching him with new attention. "Being mistaken for something you're not, I mean. Or being connected, even distantly, to people who wouldn't claim you if the connection were known." "It troubles me more than I can easily explain," he admitted, and there was a rawness in his voice she had not heard from him before, something that made her wonder, briefly and painfully, whether she had stumbled without meaning to into some private grief. "I have spent a great deal of my life being valued only for what I might become, never for what I already was. It teaches a man to distrust every kindness shown to him, wondering always what the giver hopes to gain by it." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are the first person in a great while who has shown me kindness without, I think, wanting anything from me at all. I find I do not entirely know what to do with that." "Perhaps you needn't do anything with it," she said softly, unnerved by the sudden nearness of him, the way the afternoon light caught the darkness of his eyes. "Perhaps it is enough simply to let it be true." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the air between them seemed to draw taut with something unspoken, something that trembled on the edge of confession and retreated before either of them could give it voice. He stepped back first, clearing his throat, and the moment passed, though it left its mark on her all the same, a small ember of hope and confusion she carried home that evening and turned over long into the night, wondering what exactly it was she had almost witnessed, and what he had almost said. She learned it 3 days after, when she returned to find him again, this time repairing a section of fence with his own hands, a task no gentleman would set himself to, which confirmed to her satisfaction that he was exactly what he appeared, a hired man, sensible and unassuming, paid to make the grounds presentable before whatever lawyer or heir eventually arrived to claim them. "Thomas Gray," he said, when she asked outright, a little embarrassed at her own boldness. "I have been sent to survey the estate before matters are settled." "Then you'll have your hands full," she said, glancing at the ivy strangling the west wing. "I don't envy you the accounting." "No," he agreed, with a faint smile she was beginning to look forward to without quite admitting it to herself. "Nor do I envy myself." It became, without either of them naming it, a habit. Her visits to the hives stretching longer than the bees required, his work slowing to match her pace. Conversations that began about orchard blight or roof repairs and wandered, inevitably, toward things closer to the bone. She told him of her mother, married young to a man who had wanted her dowry and grown cold once it was spent. She told him, eventually, in pieces she had not meant to give, of Sir Edmund's proposal and her refusal, though she dressed it in vaguer terms, ashamed of how precarious her situation truly was. "You refused a fortune to keep your dignity," Thomas said, when she had finished, and there was something in his voice she could not name, not pity, which she had braced for, but something closer to respect, quiet and entire. "I refused a cage with good curtains," she said. "I don't think it was so very brave. I think it was only the one thing I could not make myself do, however much sense it made on paper." "That is precisely what bravery is," he said. "Doing the one thing your conscience will not release you from, whatever the cost." She looked at him then, really looked, and noticed, not for the first time, but for the first time allowing herself to notice, that his hands, though calloused from labor, moved with an odd precision when he worked, that his speech, however plain his dress, carried none of the roughness of the laborers she had grown up among, that he watched her, sometimes, with an attention too complete to belong to idle curiosity. She told herself it meant nothing, A land agent could be well-spoken. A land agent could have gentle manners. She had no fortune to make suspicion worth the trouble, and so she allowed herself, cautiously, the small, warm luxury of his company. There were other mornings, in the weeks that followed, that Iris would later turn over in her memory, like coins whose value she had not understood at the time she spent them. There was the morning she came upon him reading, tucked into the window seat of the old orangery, with a book he had no obvious right to be handling, its spine cracked with age, and its pages the particular brittle gold of a volume, kept from the damp for generations. He had closed it quickly when he saw her, almost guiltily, and when she asked what it was, he had said only that he had found it among the estate's papers and thought it a shame to let it rot with the rest of the library, unread. She had not thought at the time to wonder why a hired land agent troubled himself with the preservation of a stranger's books. There was the afternoon a tenant farmer, an old man named Corwin, whose cottage roof had fallen into disrepair over the previous earl's long illness, came to the orchard wall in visible distress, certain he would be evicted before the new heir ever troubled himself to notice such small miseries. Thomas had listened to the man's fears with a patience Iris had rarely seen extended to anyone without rank or fortune to recommend them, and had promised, with a quiet certainty that brooked no doubt, that no family would be turned out of Rothmere land for a roof that leaked through no fault of their own. She had thought it kind. She had not thought to ask how a mere agent could make such a promise with such absolute confidence, as though the decision were entirely his own to give. And there was the evening, later than either of them should have lingered, when a sudden autumn storm caught them both far from shelter, and he had given her his coat without a moment's hesitation, standing in his shirt-sleeves in the driving rain, as though the cold meant nothing to him at all, walking her the better part of a mile back toward Wren Cottage, while thunder rolled over the hills, and neither of them spoke, because there had seemed, in that strange, charged silence, nothing that needed saying. She had returned home that night flushed with a feeling she refused to name, and had lain awake long after the storm passed, turning over the particular way he had looked at her before they parted at the gate, not as a servant regards a lady above his station, careful and correct, but as a man regards a woman he has already, quietly, without permission, begun to love. She told herself each time that she was imagining significance where none existed. A kind man could be kind without hidden cause. A gentle man could be gentle without a title to explain it. She had spent her whole life being taught that a poor woman's hopes were dangerous things, prone to inventing romance out of ordinary courtesy, and she did not wish to be the fool the whole county already half suspected her of being where Sir Edmund's fortune was concerned. And yet the hope persisted, small and stubborn, tucked away in some private corner of her heart she dared not examine too closely, for fear of what she might find waiting there if she did. It was Sir Edmund who first planted the seed of doubt, though he did not know it. He called at the cottage a fortnight later, ostensibly to inquire after Augusta's health, though Iris understood well enough that he had come to see whether hardship had softened her answer. It had not. But in the course of his visit, made brittle with false cheer, he mentioned, with the studied carelessness of a man who wished his words to land precisely where he aimed them, that the true heir to Rothmere had been located at last, and that the solicitors expected him within the month. A distant cousin, raised abroad, I understand, Sir Edmund said, watching her over the rim of his teacup. Some say he was raised quite humbly, a scandal in the family, an unfortunate marriage some 2 generations back, papers lost, that sort of tedious business. He is said to be travelling ahead of his own arrival, incognito, to see the place with his own eyes before he must play the Earl for the county's benefit. Rather a coward's approach, I think, but there it is. Some men prefer to hide rather than be seen clearly. Iris said nothing, but something cold moved through her chest, quiet and unwelcome, and she found her thoughts turning, unbidden, to a man with careful hands and a stillness that did not belong to hired labor. She told herself it was nothing. Land agents existed. Surveyors existed. She had no reason to build a lord out of borrowed rumor and a stranger's kind attention, and every reason to distrust her own longing, which had a habit of dressing plain men in finer clothes than they deserved. And yet, when she next went to the orchard wall, she found herself watching him differently, noting the fineness of the linen beneath his workman's coat, the unhurried authority with which he corrected a tenant's ledger he had no obvious right to see, the way the old housekeeper, when she thought no one watched, dropped into something dangerously close to a curtsy before catching herself. "You are quiet today," Thomas said, when she had said little for the better part of an hour. "I am wondering," she said carefully, "whether a land agent generally corrects the housekeeper's accounts and receives near curtsies for his trouble." He went very still. It was only a moment, but she saw it, and something in her chest turned over slowly, dread and hope tangled too closely to separate. "Mrs. Fenwick has served this family a long time," he said at last, choosing each word with visible care. "Old habits are not easily broken, even toward a stranger sent to do an unpleasant job." It was not a lie, precisely, but it was not the truth either, and Iris, who had spent a lifetime learning to read what people did not say, understood that she had touched something he did not wish uncovered. Not yet, perhaps not ever, at least not by her. She left earlier than usual that day, and did not return for nearly a week, telling herself it was prudence, and knowing, in the small, honest corner of her heart she could not quite silence, that it was fear, fear of what she might be building out of hope, and fear, deeper still, of what it would mean if the hope turned out to be true. The truth arrived, as truth so often does, without regard for anyone's readiness to receive it. It came on a bright, cold morning in the last week of October, when the solicitor's carriage rolled up the long drive of Rothmere Hall with a formality the estate had not seen in half a year, and half the county, forewarned by servants' gossip that could not be contained, had gathered on some pretext or other to witness the moment the new Earl was finally, officially declared. Iris had come only for her aunt's sake, sent to fetch a basket of preserves the housekeeper had promised, and found herself swept into the crowd gathering on the front steps before she could retreat. Sir Edmund was there, resplendent and self-satisfied, certain enough of his own consequence that he had positioned himself near the front, prepared to be among the first to greet the new master of Rothmere and secure whatever advantage early acquaintance might offer. Iris stood near the back, half hidden by a hedge of curious tenants, and watched the solicitor descend from his carriage, papers in hand, and clear his throat with the self-importance of a man about to alter the course of an entire county. "My lords, ladies, and good people of the parish," he began, "it is my honour to present to you the 7th Earl of Rothmere, lawful heir by unbroken line to this estate and all its holdings." And then Thomas Gray stepped down from the carriage. Not the Thomas Gray of rolled sleeves and mended fences, though it was unmistakably the same face, the same stillness, the same quiet dark eyes that had listened to her grief in the orchard without once looking away. He wore now the clothes of his true rank, and something in his bearing had shifted too, not pride, she thought dimly, through the roaring in her own ears, but the settling of a weight he had clearly carried a long while in private and must now carry in the open. "Julian Ashford, Earl of Rothmere," the solicitor finished, and the crowd erupted into the particular hush that precedes applause, the collective intake of breath of people rearranging, in real time, everything they had believed an hour before. Iris did not applaud. She could not. She stood frozen at the edge of the crowd while the ground seemed to shift beneath her, understanding all at once the shape of every conversation she had mistaken for simple kindness. The fine hands beneath the workman's coat, the housekeeper's near curtsy, the careful evasion when she had asked too close a question. He had let her speak freely of her poverty, her humiliation, her refusal of Sir Edmund, all the private shames she had never intended to hand a stranger, and he had listened the whole while, knowing precisely who he was, and precisely who she believed him to be. She felt, more than anything, exposed, as though she had undressed her grief in front of a man who had simply neglected to mention he was royalty, attending a masquerade. He found her eyes across the crowd, and something in his expression was not triumph, but something closer to dread, as though he understood exactly what she was thinking and had no ready defense against it. She did not wait to hear whatever he might have said. She turned, pushed through the hedge of onlookers with a composure she did not feel, and walked the long mile home, with her basket forgotten and her pride in ruins, while behind her the county buzzed with the news that would, by nightfall, be discussed in every parlour for 20 miles. Sir Edmund found the story before the sun had fully set. He arrived at Wren Cottage that evening with an expression Iris had not seen from him before. Not the practiced charm of a suitor, but something sharper, almost gleeful, the look of a man who has found a weapon he did not expect to be handed. "I understand you were quite friendly with the new Earl," he said, without preamble, before Augusta had even finished pouring the tea. "Under rather humbler circumstances, I am told. The whole village is saying you set your cap for a common land agent and found yourself, by great good fortune, engaged to an earl instead. Rather a stroke of luck, wouldn't you say? Or rather a stroke of design, if one were less charitable." "That is not what happened," Iris said, though her voice shook with an anger she could not fully separate from her own private shame. "Is it not? You spent, I am told, a great many hours alone with him in the orchard. Alone, unchaperoned, for weeks. I wonder what the county will make of that, once it has finished marvelling at his title. I wonder what they will call a young woman who refused an honest offer of marriage from a baronet, only to be discovered making eyes at a disguised earl in a garden." His smile did not waver. "It is a very good story, Miss Hartwell. I confess I almost admire the audacity of it, whether or not it was intentional." Augusta's teacup rattled in its saucer. "Sir Edmund, I must protest." "Protest all you like, Lady Hartwell. The note falls due at Michaelmas, regardless of what the village believes of your niece's virtue. I only thought it kind to warn you both what is being said, before it reaches you second-hand and unkindly." He left with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has planted a wound that will fester on its own. And Iris sat very still in the drawing-room, long after his carriage had gone, understanding with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its bleakness, that she had, in the space of a single afternoon, lost both her privacy and her good name, and that the man responsible for the first had not yet even attempted to account for it. He came the next morning, on foot, without the carriage or the retinue that his new consequence might have justified, and Iris, watching from the window as he approached the cottage with the same unhurried walk she remembered from the orchard, felt her resolve to refuse him entry crumble before he had even reached the gate. Augusta let him in with the flustered deference the whole county would now owe him, and withdrew, at his quiet request, to leave them a few minutes' privacy that propriety would ordinarily have forbidden, a mark, Iris understood distantly, of exactly how much power a title conferred, that even the proprieties bent themselves around it. "I did not lie to you," he said, before she could speak, standing near the door as though he did not trust himself to come closer without invitation. "I never once told you I was other than what I said. I withheld the truth. I understand that the distinction may mean very little to you now, but it means everything to me, and I would rather you knew it before you decided what to think of me." "You let me speak to you as though you were nothing," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, though it cost her dearly to keep it so. "You let me tell you things I have told no one, my father, my mother, my refusal of Sir Edmund, my fear of what would become of my aunt. I gave you all of that believing you had nothing to gain from it and nothing to lose by hearing it. And the entire time, you were measuring me, weren't you? Watching to see whether I behaved differently once I understood what you might be worth to me." "Yes," he said simply, and the admission struck her harder than any denial could have. "I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I came to Rothmere in disguise because my own father was a man deceived by a woman who loved his fortune and called it love for him, and I swore I would never again wonder, for the rest of my life, whether I was wanted for myself or for what I could provide. I meant to observe the county before I revealed myself, The tenants, the neighbours, Sir Edmund most particularly, whose management of certain debts in this parish I have reason to distrust. I did not mean to fall into conversation with a woman in an orchard who spoke to me as though I were simply a man and owed her nothing and had nothing to gain by kindness. I did not mean, least of all, to find that I could not stay away from her afterward. "And when did you mean to tell me?" she asked, and heard, despite herself, the ache beneath the anger. "Before Sir Edmund made a scandal of it, or only after, when it was convenient for you? I meant to tell you the moment I understood my own feelings clearly enough to trust them," he said, "which I confess was later than it should have been, and I am ashamed of the cost that delay has placed on you. That shame is mine to carry, Miss Hartwell, not yours. Whatever the county says of you, I will correct it publicly, at whatever cost to my own dignity, because the fault was mine entirely." She wanted, desperately, to believe him, but belief felt dangerous, a door she was not certain she could close again if it proved, after all, to be another kind of cage, a fortune's worth of charm, dressed now in an earl's coat instead of a labourer's. "I cannot simply forget that you tested me," she said quietly, "that you let me bear my grief to a man I believed had nothing at stake, when in truth you had everything at stake, and chose not to say so. I do not ask you to forget it," he said. "I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove, in time, that what grew between us in that orchard was not measured or calculated on my part, whatever else I withheld. I fell in love with a woman who refused a fortune to keep her honesty intact. I would be a poor student of my own history if I now expected her to accept anything less honest from me." She did not answer him that day. She asked him, instead, to leave, and he did, without argument, though something in his face as he went told her the asking had cost him more than his composure allowed him to show. The weeks that followed were, for Iris, a slow and humiliating education in what it meant to be discussed by people who had never troubled to know her. She was called, in turns, a schemer, a fool, an innocent victim of a cruel man's game, depending on which parlour the gossip passed through, and she found she could bear none of the versions easily, because none of them were entirely false, and none of them were entirely true either. Augusta, to her credit, defended her fiercely wherever she could, though the debt at Michaelmas loomed closer with every week, and Sir Edmund, sensing his advantage slipping, grew bolder in his insinuations, dropping hints in company that he alone had been willing to offer Miss Hartwell an honest, undisguised proposal, and had been repaid with humiliation for his trouble. Matters were made no simpler by the arrival, within days of Julian's public unveiling, of his father's elder sister, the formidable Lady Constance Ashford, who descended upon Rothmere with a retinue of trunks and opinions in equal measure, determined to see her nephew settled into his new consequence with a wife suited to it. She had brought with her, not entirely by accident, a young woman of excellent family and considerable fortune, a Miss Cordelia Whitmore, whose connections reached into 3 separate peerages, and whose manner toward Iris, on the single occasion they were introduced at a dinner Lady Constance insisted upon hosting, was a masterpiece of civil condescension that left no doubt as to how thoroughly the matter had already been decided in certain quarters of the family. "You must not think me unkind, my dear," Lady Constance said to Iris afterward, drawing her aside with the particular gentleness powerful women reserve for those they intend to dismiss. "But you must see how it appears. An orchard romance, conducted while my nephew wore another man's coat, so to speak. It makes for a charming tale in a novel, but Rothmere requires a countess who understands the weight of the name, not merely the weight of her own feelings. Miss Whitmore has been raised from the cradle for exactly this purpose. Surely you would not wish to see Julian's inheritance made a subject of ridicule for the sake of a passing infatuation." Iris said nothing in her own defence that evening, though the words lodged themselves deep and did not leave easily. She had weathered Sir Edmund's scandal, and emerged, she had thought, with her dignity intact. She found she had far less armour against the quieter, more devastating suggestion that she was simply insufficient, not scandalous, merely inadequate, a passing fancy to be managed and outgrown once duty reasserted itself. When Julian sought her out later that night, flushed with anger at his aunt's interference, she found she could not fully unburden herself of the doubt Lady Constance had planted, however gently, and however much he protested that his aunt's opinions carried no weight whatsoever, in a decision that was entirely his own to make. She is not entirely wrong that the county expects a particular kind of countess, Iris said quietly, unable to keep the ache from her voice. I have no fortune, Julian. I have no connections that could be of use to you. I bring you nothing but the debt Sir Edmund tried to manufacture, and a scandal half the parish still whispers about. I do not know how to be the woman your aunt believes Rothmere deserves. I did not ask Rothmere what it deserved, Julian said, with a heat she had not heard from him before. I asked my own heart, which has never once, in the whole of this business, mistaken you for insufficient. My aunt has buried 2 husbands and outlived every fortune either of them left her, and still she believes a marriage is a transaction to be negotiated like a treaty. I will not build my life on her arithmetic. But the doubt, once seeded, proved harder to uproot than either of them wished, and in the weeks that followed, as Lady Constance continued her campaign with the patient persistence of a woman accustomed to getting her way, and as Miss Whitmore was paraded through every social occasion the county could contrive, Iris found herself withdrawing by careful degrees, declining invitations to Rothmere, answering Julian's letters with a briskness that cost her a great deal more than it revealed, convincing herself that the kindest gift she could offer him was the freedom to choose, without her presence complicating the choice, whether duty or feeling ought to govern a man in his position. It was, she told herself, not retreat, but generosity. It felt, in the quiet hours before sleep, indistinguishable from heartbreak. It was the arrival of a second visitor to Wren Cottage, a fortnight later, that finally began to unravel the shape of things. He came unannounced, an elderly solicitor's clerk who had served the Rothmere estate for 30 years, and asked to speak with Lady Hartwell privately regarding certain papers he had found, while sorting the old Earl's correspondence, that he believed touched upon matters of some delicacy to her household. The papers, when Augusta finally showed them to Iris with trembling hands, told a story neither of them had known to look for. Sir Edmund's note upon the cottage, it transpired, had been purchased from the original lender at a steep discount some years before. Under circumstances, the old Earl himself had begun quietly investigating before his death, for the original debt, incurred by Iris's father in a moment of misfortune, had very nearly been settled in full before he died, and the remaining balance Sir Edmund now held over their heads had been artificially inflated through a series of manipulated accounts, the same accounts, it seemed, that the new Earl had privately begun to suspect during his weeks of quiet observation as a land agent. He knew, Augusta whispered, staring at the papers. He must have known, or suspected it, weeks ago. Iris, this is why he came in disguise, not merely to test the county's character in the abstract. He was investigating Sir Edmund specifically. Iris felt something in her chest loosen, slowly, painfully, like a held breath finally released. It did not undo the wound of having been observed without her knowledge, but it altered the shape of it, softened the edges of betrayal into something closer to a complicated, imperfect honesty. A man who had come seeking justice for the vulnerable and had not expected to find, along the way, a reason to want justice for one particular woman above all others. She went to Rothmere the next morning, for the first time since the day of his revelation, and found him in the library, poring over ledgers with the same quiet intensity she remembered from the orchard, though the fine coat and the great room around him no longer looked, to her eyes, like a costume he did not deserve. You knew of Sir Edmund's debts, she said, without greeting, standing in the doorway until he looked up. Before you ever spoke to me, that was why you came. It was part of why I came, he said, rising. I will not pretend it was the whole of it, nor that I regret how the rest unfolded, whatever pain it has cost you. I had suspicions of Sir Edmund's dealings within a week of arriving. I did not expect to find, in the course of confirming them, a woman whose situation made his cruelty personal to me in a way no ledger ever could. And what do you mean to do with what you've found? Expose him, Julian said simply. Publicly and without mercy, for I find I have very little patience left for men who prey upon women with no one to defend them. The debt on your aunt's cottage was manufactured through fraud. It will be dissolved entirely, and Sir Edmund will answer to the magistrate for the manner in which he obtained it, and for several other matters besides, once the full accounting is complete. Relief moved through her, sharp and dizzying, but beneath it something else stirred too, a recognition that he had not offered to simply pay off the debt himself, as a wealthy man might have done to buy her gratitude, but had instead pursued the truth of the matter for its own sake, because the injustice itself offended him, quite apart from what it meant for her. "Why do you look at me as though you expect me to be angry with you for this too?" he said gently, watching her face. "Because I do not yet know how to separate the parts of you I trust from the parts I am still afraid to," she admitted. "You have given me a great deal to forgive and a great deal to be grateful for in the same breath, and I find I cannot untangle them cleanly." "Then do not untangle them yet," he said. "Only allow me the chance to earn the trust properly, in the open now, with nothing left concealed between us. I will not ask you to decide anything until you are ready. I have caused you enough harm through haste already." It was the public unmasking of Sir Edmund, 3 weeks later, that finally restored to Iris the dignity the gossip had tried to strip from her. Julian called a gathering of the parish's principal families under the pretense of announcing his formal assumption of the estate, and used the occasion instead to lay out, with cold and methodical precision, the full extent of Sir Edmund's manipulated accounts, not merely the fraudulent debt against Wren Cottage, but a pattern of similar cruelties visited upon at least 3 other tenant families, whose modest debts he had inflated and held over their heads for years to secure favors, silence, or simply the pleasure of power over people too poor to fight him. Sir Edmund's protests grew increasingly frantic as the evidence mounted, and by the time Julian finished speaking, the same drawing rooms that had gossiped so eagerly about Iris's supposed scheming had turned, with the fickle speed gossip always shows, entirely against the man who had orchestrated her humiliation in the first place. He left the gathering in disgrace, his reputation in ruins, his creditors already circling with the same hunger he had once shown to weaker families, and Iris felt no triumph in his fall, only a quiet, aching relief that the truth, however delayed, had finally been permitted to speak for itself. Lady Constance had been among the guests that evening, seated near the front with Miss Whitmore at her side, and had watched the unravelling of Sir Edmund's schemes with the same cool composure she brought to every social occasion, until Julian, having finished the whole of his account, turned to address the room a final time. "There is one further matter I wish to settle publicly, while I have the attention of the parish," he said, and Iris, standing near the back as she had on the day of his revelation, felt her breath catch at the sudden shift in his voice. "It has been suggested to me, by those who love me and wish to see Rothmere well governed, that a man in my position owes his choice of wife to considerations of fortune and family, rather than to considerations of the heart. I have listened to that counsel with the respect it deserves, and I have concluded that it is wrong. I mean to marry Miss Iris Hartwell, if she will still have me after the injuries my silence has cost her, not because it is expedient, but because she is the only woman I have ever met who spoke to me honestly before she knew I could do anything for her in return. I would rather govern this estate with her at my side and my aunt's disapproval at my back than govern it brilliantly and alone." A murmur went through the assembled guests, equal parts scandal and delight, and Lady Constance's expression, Iris saw with some private astonishment, softened by degrees into something almost like resigned admiration, the look of a formidable woman, recognizing, however reluctantly, a will equal to her own. Miss Whitmore, for her part, appeared more relieved than wounded, and would confide to a mutual acquaintance within the month that she had never had the slightest interest in Julian personally, only in satisfying an aunt whose good opinion she could ill afford to lose, and that she wished the new Earl and his Countess every happiness with considerable sincerity. "You did not need to make it so public," she said to Julian afterward, when the guests had gone and only the two of them remained in the great hall, candlelight throwing long shadows across the old stone floor. "I did," he said. "You were made to bear a scandal in public. It was only just that your vindication be equally public. I would not have you whispered about in corners while your injuries went undefended in the light." "You have given me back what he tried to take," she said softly. "I do not know how to thank you for that, without it sounding like the very transaction I refused him for." "Then do not thank me," Julian said, crossing the space between them slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished it. "Tell me instead whether there is any part of you still willing to trust the man you met in that orchard, disguise and all, now that you know the whole of what he was hiding and why." She looked at him a long moment, weighing the weeks of doubt and grief and cautious hope against the steadiness of his gaze, and found at last that the answer had been settled in her heart long before her pride allowed her to admit it. "I trusted him then," she said quietly. "I think I have never entirely stopped, however much I told myself I ought to. I was only afraid that trusting him meant admitting how much I had already begun to love a man I believed had nothing to offer me but honesty. It is rather more frightening to learn he can offer everything, and that I must now wonder whether I am worthy of it." "You were worthy of it in the orchard, with nothing but a smoker and a basket of comb to your name," Julian said, and his voice had roughened with something he did not try to hide. "You are no more or less worthy of it now, in a hall full of candles. I did not fall in love with an estate's worth of consequence, Iris. I fell in love with a woman who would rather be ruined than owned, and I have spent every day since wondering how I might convince her that loving her costs me nothing and gains her nothing but a man who intends to spend the rest of his life proving he meant every word he said before he ever wore this title in her presence." She closed the last small distance between them herself, and when he kissed her, it was without the caution either of them had carried through every prior conversation, without titles or debts or the county's opinion standing between them, only the plain, hard-won certainty of two people who had each, in their own way, refused to be loved for anything less than the truth of who they were. The wedding, when it came the following spring, was not the grand society affair the county's more ambitious mothers might have arranged for an earl, though it was attended, in the end, by nearly the whole parish, drawn as much by curiosity as by genuine affection for the story that had passed, by then, into local legend. Augusta wept through the entire ceremony, though whether from relief at the dissolved debt or simple joy at her niece's happiness, she herself could not afterward say with certainty, and likely it was both in equal measure. Iris wore, at her own insistence, a gown far simpler than the occasion strictly demanded, and Julian, watching her walk toward him through the small chapel at Rothmere with the same steady composure she had shown him from the very first day in the orchard, thought privately that he had never in his life seen anything closer to what he understood, at last, real nobility to mean. They kept the bees at Wren Cottage afterward, as a private joke between them that grew, over the years, into something closer to a shared ritual, the new Countess of Rothmere returning each autumn to tend the hives with her own hands, refusing every offer of a servant to do the work for her, while her husband, who had once pretended poverty to learn the truth of a woman's heart, watched from the orchard wall with the particular quiet happiness of a man who had found, against every fear his own father's history had taught him to carry, that he was loved entirely for himself. Lady Constance, true to the resilient nature that had carried her through 2 husbands and any number of thwarted campaigns, made her peace with the marriage within the year, arriving each Christmas thereafter with gifts of increasing extravagance and opinions of only slightly diminished frequency, until even she was forced to admit, watching her nephew at his own table with his wife beside him, and genuine laughter in a house that had stood cold and uncertain for the better part of a year, that some arithmetic simply could not account for what she was seeing, and that perhaps, it had never been meant to. Augusta lived to see the debt, not merely dissolved, but the cottage itself signed over to her outright, a gift Julian insisted upon over her tearful protests, and she spent her remaining years dividing her time between Wren Cottage and Rothmere, with the settled contentment of a woman who had feared, not so very long before, that she would end her days apologizing for a burden she had never asked to carry. She took a particular, unashamed pride in reminding anyone who would listen that she had raised the future Countess of Rothmere from a girl of 16, though she was equally quick to admit, in her more honest moments, that Iris had needed remarkably little raising, having arrived already possessed of more backbone than most grown women managed in a lifetime. Sir Edmund's fall from grace proved as thorough as his cruelty had been casual. Stripped of the fraudulent debts that had padded his fortune and shunned by the very families whose favour he had once purchased through manufactured misery, he removed himself from the county within the year and was heard of only rarely afterward, in the sort of hushed, satisfied rumour that follows a man whose reckoning has finally caught up with his reputation. Iris found, when she thought of him at all, that she felt no lingering anger, only a distant gratitude, strange as it seemed, for the very cruelty that had first driven her into an orchard she might otherwise never have troubled to visit so often, and into the path of a quiet stranger, mending a fence that was not, strictly speaking, his to mend. The bees at Wren Cottage were kept, afterward, as a private joke between husband and wife that grew, over the years, into something closer to a shared ritual. The new Countess of Rothmere, returning each autumn to tend the hives with her own hands, refusing every offer of a servant to do the work for her, while her husband, who had once pretended poverty to learn the truth of a woman's heart, watched from the orchard wall with the particular quiet happiness of a man who had found, against every fear his own father's history had taught him to carry, that he was loved entirely for himself. There were difficult seasons still to come, as there are in any true marriage worth the name, a harvest failure in their third year together that tested every resource the estate possessed, a long illness that kept Julian from her side for the better part of a winter, the small, ordinary frictions of two strong-willed people learning to share a single life after each had spent so long guarding their hearts alone. But Iris found, through each of these trials, that the foundation they had built in that first autumn, honesty offered before either of them had anything obvious to gain from it, held steady beneath whatever weather came, in a way she suspected a marriage built on fortune or convenience alone might never have managed. And when their own daughter was old enough to ask, years later, curled beside the fire on a winter evening with the particular solemn curiosity children reserve for the stories that matter most to them, how her parents had first met, Iris would set aside her needlework and tell her, smiling, of a quiet stranger who had mended a fence he had no obvious reason to mend, and had listened to a poor woman's grief in an orchard heavy with the last roses of autumn, as though it were the most valuable thing in the entire county, which, in the end, it had turned out to be, and which, Iris always finished, was the truest thing she could teach her, that the worth of a person was never in the name they carried, but in the quality of attention they were willing to give a heart no one else had thought worth the trouble of knowing.